Well, good morning, everybody. Welcome to the castle, hosted by New Dawn Pubs and young Mark, who always says he's got nothing to say.
Well, I've always got something to say, but it's nice to have everybody here. Nice to have Rupert here.
Yeah.
Thank you, Mark.
Has the menu changed slightly, or did I mean?
It always changes.
Yeah.
It forever changes.
So make sure you come down and try the menu. We're here to get some money for Phyllis Tuckwell, and young Tom will probably have something to say at the end. I owe you all an apology, as I've bored most of you at some point. You know I coach cricket, and I'm very fortunate that Hampshire County Cricket Club actually pay me to coach the little girls in the north of the county during half term, so I need to run away quite sharpish, and I haven't got time to get changed. So apologies, Rupert. This is Rupert. Do you want to introduce yourself?
I'm the managing director and owner of Hogsback Brewery.
And you supply this establishment, I believe.
Yes, we do. We're very proud to. Tea and Hogstar on here, I think, and maybe a few other things in the and Hazy Hog and Hazy Hog cider.
If you haven't tried it, try it. So, Rupert, where did you grow up? Where did it all start?
Well, I grew up in Yorkshire. Actually, I was born in Dorset, but grew up in Yorkshire. Where the brewing side started is I went to school in Northamptonshire and then on to university in Scotland, St Andrews, and enjoyed 4 years of frankly doing very little. And at the end of it, thought I'd better get a proper job, and I applied to a number of graduate training schemes, and one of them was for BAS, and I joined BAS. And it was, I hadn't had that much interest in commerce before that, but I was fascinated by advertising and by drinks advertising in particular, and that's because one of my uncles was a director of what was then called Distillers, and which subsequently became Diageo, and he had a whiskey brand called Black and White Whiskey, if anybody remembers it, and Buchanan's, and he used to fly all over the world as a kind of sales and marketing manager. I thought, or director actually, and he had a wonderful office in St James's, and I thought, well, you can't really do much better than that, and so I thought, well, beer is similar to whiskey, so I'll probably end up flying all over the world drinking lots of beer. Sadly, that didn't work out quite. But
Say you started work, and what role did you start in?
So I was a graduate trainee, and at the time, I mean, it's hard to believe now, but at that time, this was in 1980, you kind of expected you might stay in the business for life, and they invested a lot. So ours was a 5-year training program in theory. I have to say there was it was really well laid out, and then as soon as it actually happened, it all went chaotically wrong. I suspect for most of the trainees, but I think we were the second cohort. BAS, despite being at the time, BAS was the 8th largest company in the UK, and it was the 8th largest on the stock exchange, I should say. It was absolutely massive. It had about 8,000 pubs, 7,600 actually, I think it was, 7,600 pubs. It had, obviously, it was the biggest brewery in the UK. It was the world's biggest hotelier with Holiday Inns, would you believe? Crest Hotels in the UK and then Holiday Inns worldwide. Biggest, I think it was the biggest bookie, biggest wine importer, just enormous. And so we were meant to go and spend time in a lot of those. Prior to us joining as graduates, they'd always recruited from the army. So you left the army after short-term commission and you go into the brewers. But that started to change. They hired, we were the second cohort, and I went into Mitchells and Butlers in the Midlands, and there were I think there were 6 of us that time. There'd been three the previous year, then 6, and then it went to kind of 10. And 3-year program, you start with 6 months, 3 months just being shown around training. Then you had a first placement of a year and a half, I think it was. Then you had a central job and then a second placement. So that was a 5-year program. And I started doing, actually, they couldn't find a sales job. So I ended up running pubs for a while, 40 odd pubs. By the way, I can go on at length about this, but there's some fascinating stories about life at that time. One of the things was these 40 pubs were supposed to be buying beer from us, but because they hadn't been visited by anybody for so long, they were generally buying the beer, but they weren't buying any of the wines and spirits that they were supposed to be. And I went into one place after another and would look round, and I didn't recognise any of the wines or spirits, and they were all buying outside of Thai, and that actually is a breach of their basic tenancy agreement. So I was kind of thinking, well, how the hell do I handle this? So anyway, on the first one, the first tenant, I went in and I said, look, you've got to start buying our whiskey and wine, and in fact, you're out of your tenancy agreement. So he jumped straight into his Rolls Royce. Which probably tells you something about our rents as well at the time, and goes and complains to the managing director, who pulls me in and says, look, when we've got these rules, it doesn't mean you have to actually apply them. And so anyway, there are many stories like that. I spent a bit of time in there, then I went on as a salesman, and then I went back to running pubs, but this time it was managed and tenanted pubs, quite big, 40 tenancies and 12 managed pubs, and you were expected to run these just on your own, but with relatively limited backup. And again, the principles were, all you really want to do is to make sure they bought the beer from you and sold as much beer as possible, because that's where we made our money. Pretty relaxed on everything else. But even that was a challenge, because we would find that we didn't pay the managers anything like enough. I do remember we paid them about $5,000 a year for running a huge pub, and with all that stress, just was not a lot. I mean, it was a long time ago, of course, but it was still not a lot of money. And yet, funnily enough, it wasn't just the tenant in that pub that I called out who was driving a Rolls Royce, but many of them were driving Jaguars after 6-8 weeks. How's that happen? Well, because actually they weren't buying all the beer from us, and they would put some beer from the wholesaler through. They'd have their own till, and at the weekend they'd be running up the beer would go through. We wouldn't know anything about it, and they'd pocket. These were big pubs doing at the time 5,000-7,000 a week. Well, 5,000-7,000 a week, if you compare that to the salaries, you can see that it was enormous, and it was all cash, no credit cards, so it was terribly easy to put 500 in your back pocket, and you didn't need many £500 a week before you could afford a Jaguar. Anyway, so I was a bit of a policeman there, and I probably should shut up and let you ask me.
Well, that's interesting, because at that time I was probably sat on the other side, and I did accounts for several pubs that were turning over $1 million plus. Which,
lots of money.
Yeah, of course, not all inside Thai, as you correctly say. So how did you go from there to where you are now?
So from there I moved into marketing, first of all regional marketing, and we were marketing a number of local brands up in the north, brands like Stone's Best Bitters. Anybody heard of Stone's Best Bitter? And we were actually advertising for a while. We were advertising our pubs. We had a TV campaign advertising pubs and all the promotions that were going, which was very unusual at the time. I then went to headquarters and carried on with Stones, and then I had a brand called Tennant's Pilsner, and what I was responsible for was all the marketing and the advertising, and particularly advertising at the time. So I did all the Stones adverts, and they were wonderful because the story, the line was, wherever you may wander, there's no taste like Stones. And it was always the same formula. You'd open in an exotic part of the world, something very silly would happen, and actually at the end of it there was a pint of Stones there. And I managed to make sure that the exotic parts of the world were Fiji and Australia, in my case.
Did you get to go?
Oh yeah, of course.
Just want to make sure.
I mean, I could tell you some stories there, but I won't at the time, because that was, so I was on the brand side, and then I finally finished marketing, a brand director for Carling, which is the biggest Bass's brand, and it was and may still be the biggest beer brand in the UK. And we developed a new strategy, and this is this was quite a change. We decided to we were at about 2 million barrels, which is at the time about 100 million. It was more than that. So it was about 100 million of profit contribution to the group. So a very big brand. And we were spending about 20 million a year on just broadly TV advertising, a bit of marketing. But on top of that, regionally, there was another 5 million or so going into sponsorships of one sort or another, cricket, football, but all a bit sporadic and all based on doing deals with local clubs. And so what I did is I felt that actually Carling only had 10% market share, despite being the biggest brand in the UK. And by the way, one of the biggest grocery brands, actually. But I felt that there was a chance that we could take that to 20%, because if you looked at many other beer markets around the world, and I was particularly looking at the States and Anheuser-Busch Budweiser, they were getting 20%, the leading brand would have 20% market share. At least if you didn't, you actually hadn't got a strong enough market position long term. So we completely cranked everything, we changed everything, changed the advertising. Wonderful advertising before. I Bet He Drinks Carling Black Label won all sorts of awards. I went up and got in advertising, it's the kind of pinnacle, it's a gold D&AD award for the Dam Busters advert, if any of you remember it. I have to say I was a complete fraud because I didn't, my predecessor did that advert. But so it goes, because in fact, we developed this campaign, which itself won loads of awards. What we did is we changed the advertising completely, but because what had become very evident is this wonderful advertising line, I Bet You Drink Carling, had become so widely known that it got disconnected from the brand, and it wasn't actually driving sales very much. And we were spending about 12 million at the time, and which then was big, but now will be absolutely enormous. Beer doesn't really advertise so much on TV now. It's kind of, the world has moved on. So we changed that. We changed the packaging. We changed the name. It used to be called Carling Black Label, and I changed it just to Carling. In retrospect, I think I would have gone back now. It's interesting how you do these things. It was right at the time, but actually I now look at that name, and I think actually I would have stuck with Carling Black Label as it happened. But it's been Carling ever since. But the most important thing is we developed a strategy to attack our competitors. So we advertised that we were 4.1% ABV, knowing that all of our competitors were between 3.4 and 3.7. And it was a very challenging attack, but it is about going right to the heart of product quality and what it was delivering to the consumer. We knew in blind taste tests, Carling would beat all the competitors, except one, funny enough, which was Skoll. But it would,
Did you put that in the test?
We put Skoll. No, we didn't put Skoll. Sorry, the test.
Yes. Did you put Skoll in the taste test?
We did. We actually used to, here's another story. We used to do what's called extended session drinking tests.
You got a few takers here already.
Well, it was great for the first night and maybe the second night. But what we used to do is get people into a hall, and they had to come for 3 nights. They were basically given as much to drink as they wanted. They could choose from font A, B, or C, and you measured where they start. You did a sip test at the beginning. What do you think of the 3? You then drink as much as you like, and you watched how they drank on the first, second, and third night to establish what might be the difference between their sip test and their habit. And the habit was the thing that we were after, because actually at the time, people would go into a pub 5 days a week, and they would drink 4 or 5, 6 pints a night. So it was habitual at that stage, and it was also kind of quite physical. I mean, some beers have more CO2 than others, and I could go on at length about the organoleptics of the whole thing, but essentially what we were doing is trying to establish what was going to work in long-term drinking. Anyway, going back to the story, Carling was a bit stronger, and so we advertised that fact. And of course, we did it in a short burst, a poster campaign, because I thought there would be a problem, or we all thought there would be a problem. And I think that was just posters all around the country, just for 1 month, just highlighting with very simple pictures. And of course, there was a problem after a couple of weeks, because the chairman started to get rung by all the other chairmen saying this is outrageous, you shouldn't be doing this. And we knew that at some point we might have the posters taken down, but they never did get taken down because it was all entirely fair and it was fair comment. And funnily enough, all the other brewers then moved their strength up. The story behind that, this is commercial, this is about the other side of kind of marketing. This was about hurting the competitor, because for Heineken, which was at 3.4, if they'd moved it up, it was going to cost them about 8 million extra in duty. So, and I think Foster's was about 6 or 7 million. Carlsberg was about 4 or 5 million. Well, this was huge money. And, you know, it was about the same size as their advertising campaigns. They didn't have that much money, but they had to do it. And by the way, they also then had to change all the fonts. These great big fonts, and every bar, they had to change them because they got the wrong ABV on. So that was going to cost them another couple of million. And we actually kind of worked this out. And it was very aggressive marketing, but it worked. It forced our competitors to spend money that they didn't want to spend on something they didn't want to spend it on, because we'd set the standard. And the other thing we did is sponsor the Premier League, and that was a story in itself. But believe it or not, the Premier League was coming together for the first time. It was really, really hard, because you got some clubs didn't want to be part of it, and we've actually seen that again recently, where there was an attempted breakout. At the time, they managed to pull the clubs together, so there was a Premier League, and suddenly there was huge amounts of Sky TV money going in. They needed a headline sponsor, and we got it for £5 million a year. Now, 5 million a year was an absolute steal. We didn't, and we had reservations. I think every brewer did, because of all the football hooligan problems that had been going on in the 80s. But by the end of the 80s, that was beginning to ease off, and we felt it was safe enough to advertise beer, and so it happened. And actually, that was a huge success, because I think for 3 years we had it 5 million. I think then I don't know what the figure was, because I'd left by then. But I think it went up to 20 or 30 million, and it was still good value. So we'd got, and it made a huge difference in Carling. The Carling brand name did actually get from 10% to 20% market share. So again, a big digression.
Yeah, it's all good. It's all good.
So from there,
to get the hogs back, yeah.
So from there, I then went to Moreland, who were a regional brewer, and I joined the board, and they were a PLC. So from my point of view, getting main board experience for a publicly quoted company was important, but it also meant I ran most of the business. I ran all the tenanted operation and the brewery. And there was a little brand there called Old Speckled Hen that was very small at the time, smaller than tea is now. And to start with, I was more interested in the pubs, actually, because, I mean, they were, it's really interesting, a lot of them, and there were a lot of problems. But actually, over time, I became much more interested in a tiny little brand that started to grow, and we did various things, and it became very successful. And in fact, then there was a takeover by Green King, and Green King bought the whole business. I had tried to do a management buyout with through a VC called Alchemy, who were at this time also trying to buy, if any of you remember, British Leyland, John Moulton, British Leyland, and subsequently the Phoenix Four, who managed to get it and managed to enrich themselves to a quite extraordinary extent while bankrupting the business. John Moulton wanted this business and was painted as the big bad VC. Actually, he had an intention to develop MG as a brand, develop it as a brand, and would have kept many, many more jobs in the UK, would have created a great brand, because all the building blocks were there with MG. And I think it was Patricia Hewitt at the time just said, unacceptable face of capitalism or something, and that was just enough. So it was a classic example of politicians getting in and completely screwing everything up. No understanding.
And missing the point.
I mean, entirely missing the point. Everything about that decision was wrong. lost a lot of British manufacturing eventually, lost a lot of jobs, just wrong. Anyway, at the same time, we were trying to get Alchemy to back us to buy Moreland, which we kind of nearly did, but our big intention was to push the price up, because as executive directors, once the company's in play, which essentially we were as a public company, our job was to push the price up as high as we could. And we did. We managed to get it up about 20% by bringing other players in. And that was a fantastic result for our shareholders. But then obviously Green King weren't so keen on us as a result. So we had to find new jobs, which actually suited me fine, because I'd actually been given a 3-year contract, rolling contract, which was unbelievable, because Moreland was always at risk of another takeover. So the only way they could deal with that was to give me this long contract, which was fantastic, because it did give me a bit of a cushion. But actually I then worked with Alchemy and a guy called Rupert, who was a serial entrepreneur, to buy the beer brands from Usher's Brewery. And we just bought the beer brands and created a brands only business, no brewery at the time. Then subsequently the brewery was actually closed and sold to, believe it or not, North Korea. And Usher's Brewery was taken apart bit by bit. Every single nut and bolt was put on a boat. And I think there were something like 100 North Korean engineers there for 3 months taking this apart. And then they rebuilt it all in North Korea, and it's now the biggest brewery in North Korea. But meanwhile, I'd moved the brewing across to another brewery, and then I bought Wychwood Brewery, which had a brand called Hobgoblin, and Breakspear. I took a 20-year lease on the brand Breakspear, and we were handling Lowenbrow in the UK and various other agency brands. We did Wadworth, 6X in the off-trade, we did Brains for a while, various other brands. And Innis & Gunn, that was a big one. We launched Innis & Gunn in the UK. And then I sold the business to Marston's in 2008. And it was actually just months before the financial crisis. And there was still quite a lot of money around at the time. A few months later, absolutely nothing. And I was congratulated for my foresight. And of course, I took all the congratulations, but I had absolutely no idea at all that this was going to happen. But I just felt I wanted to move on. And then subsequently from that, I was looking at buying one of the major UK beer brands, Bass, back from Anheuser-Busch. But by then, it was owned by, I say Anheuser-Busch. Anheuser-Busch was owned by Brazilians, and we started dealing with Brazilian bankers. And after a while, I realized that I wasn't going to get a bargain. And that was the only way we could have afforded it. But it was quite a big deal. And from my point of view, it was almost coming full circle. I would love to have had Bass, because I felt it was a really strong brand and still had potential. But actually, I'd also been talking to some other brewers, and one of them was here, Martin Hunt and Tony Stanton-Precious were, they'd been running Hogsback for 20 years. They founded it and they were running it, and it had been a great success, but I think they felt they'd rather run out of steam. And they also kind of had stopped talking to each other, which is a big problem when you're kind of co-owners of a business. And so I took over, and I've been with the business for 12 years now, and you can see there's been a lot of change. I was really keen on Hogsback for a couple of reasons. My mother's family lived just over the hill at Milford, farmed at Milford, Oxenford Grange, if anybody knows it. They sell the Christmas trees at Christmas, yeah? And that's where my grandfather farmed, and so it's the most lovely place. If you have to think of a farm life, you think of this place. I did. But of course, it was a complete contrivance by Lord Middleton at the time, who built these buildings employing the architect Pugin, to help him, and the Pugin went on to build the House of Commons and everything else. So it was all a complete fiction in a way, but a lovely, lovely place. And it's always kind of I always felt very fond of the area as a result. My mother always talks very fondly of it, and so it was almost like coming home in a way. And I suppose I was also felt that there was a big opportunity in London. There were at the time 5 breweries in London, and there were no kind of local brands, and particularly no local lager brands. And I felt there was a massive opportunity to get in with a lager brand. And indeed that turned out to be absolutely true. But unfortunately lots of other people figured it out as well, because I think I bought the business in 2011. We developed Hogstar almost immediately. The first thing I did is hire a new brewer, because lager had been anathema at Hogsback, which I didn't buy at all. I felt lager's an important part of beer. But so I got a new brewer in from Bass, Coors by then. And Miles developed Hogstar lager, and that's what we were going to take into London. But by then, we were starting to see lots of brewers emerge. There's now 160 odd small brewers in London. And in fact, we've gone through a complete cycle. It's amazing how fast these things happen, because somebody came in 2 or 3 years later, 2 years later with Camden. And then Meantime got absolutely revived by somebody who subsequently became a non-exec for us at Hogsback, Nick Miller, and he grew Meantime into a big brand again, and then Camden came along. They had a lot of backing. They had a very clear strategy: get in, build a lager brand, sell it, and they did that in something like 5 or 6 years. Amazing story. And in fact, so did Logan Plant at Beavertown. He's done exactly the same thing: get in, create a brand, sell it to a global. And that is the game. And if you do that, I mean, just to give you some, I mean, these are eye-watering numbers. I think Meantime generated a profit of about profit before tax of about 300,000. So 300,000, well, the normal multiples might be 10, 15 times. They sold it for 130 million pounds. Wow. Camden had, similar sort of, I think it had almost no pre-tax profits, and it was sold for 85 million. And Beavertown was sold for at least 100 million, so you can see, if you could sell to a global, they took the brand, and for them it was peanuts. They actually put it through their distribution channels, and they could turn that brand from a turnover of 10 or 15 million to a turnover of 200 million. But the other thing they could do is replace, say, Stella with Camden. Stella had been so commoditized that you could hardly, the brewer, Whitbread at the time, had this fantastic brand that they couldn't really make a lot of money out of. Camden, at the other end, was very expensive. So if you applied economies of scale to a beer that was very that was very popular and very highly priced, the margins were eye-watering. So they would have probably made, at least on every barrel that they managed to swap over, they probably made 4 times as much money. But they've then multiplied it. And the final thing is, of course, they had so many deals going on around the world. And as an accountant, you'll probably know this. You will know this. If you choose the right jurisdiction, you can kind of put a value on a brand, and therefore, if you sell it, you can make a loss. And then you can
Mark might know this, because it tends to be the Nordic countries that've got the best.
You're saying nothing to me.
He's not denying it.
Well, the one actually, because I did a deal in. This was back in my old company. I did a deal to buy a brand. And funny enough, it turned out that this brand had been registered in Holland. You think, why Holland? I mean, it's a traditional English beer. It's because of this trademark. It's because of the different way that that brands are accounted for. And of course, this meant you could have huge losses. So if you paid 100 million for something, if you'd got a losses of £1 billion, and some of the, this was all in the context, by the way, of massive global consolidation of the beer market. If you'd paid, 100 million, it was just money that otherwise you're going to have to pay to the taxman. It was kind of free money in a way. So it was just an absolute no-brainer. And if you were kind of, so anyway, that was, the plan A was to launch this lager in London. And actually, what happened is we kind of concluded that wasn't going to work. And something more important emerged, which is, and for me, it was very important, is I've kind of been building businesses and then selling them on. And actually, I didn't want to do that. I wanted to just try and see if we could create a business that had a strong local following and do the right things for that business. And that's what we've spent most of the last 10 years doing. I mean, I think it would have been great if Hogstar or one of our lager brands, and by the way, we're very shortly going to be launching a new brand and a new proposition, a completely new proposition, and I think that's probably going to have a lot of legs. But what we've now learned is that's kind of bonus. We would just sell that, we will limit our sales, and we will just focus on being a really strong local brewer, but hopefully a brewer first and foremost, because that's what we've always been. And if we can fill our brewery with high margin beer, that would be great. But whatever happens, we're committed to trying to stay local and buy local, support local, and support the local community.
Yeah, let's focus on the hogs back for a little while, because obviously you want to buy local, support local, but you've got some sort of green stuff you work on as well, haven't you?
Yeah. I mean, I think there's a number of principles here. I mean, just going back to developing local, one of the early things I did, and I was aware of Farnham's hop growing heritage, because I don't know how I was, but I knew that Farnham hops were at one time the most sought after hops in the UK, and brewers would pay up to a 30% premium for Farnham hops. This is going back 150 years. And
I've got the hop off. Thank you. Very interesting.
Yeah. How much time have we got before? Because I can talk at length, as you can probably tell.
Put it this way, if we get to 8:45, we'll stop. But about 9:30. You keep going. Follow my lead.
So Farnham has a wonderful hop heritage, and if you look around, even on the high street here, you'll see little hop leaves on quite a lot of the houses, and that was because and there was interestingly a banking heritage as well, and you found that people who were some of the banking families also hop growers, and there is a reason for that related, I think, to creditworthiness. But all of Farnham was surrounded by hops at one time, and there were hops going as far as Guildford, less on that side, but all the way to Alton, and they 150 years ago they commanded a significant premium, and they were very profitable, cash crop essentially. So I was aware of the history, and I felt one of the things we could do is bring that history back by reviving Farnham White Vine and building a hop garden by the brewery. And so that was about heritage, and it was also about saying, well, what is a local brewer? Well, a local brewer really needs to use local ingredients and be linked to the locality. Otherwise, if you're on an industrial estate and you're just buying hops from anywhere in the world, you're buying malt from the cheapest supplier, what's local about that other than a name? And it's important to have a bit of substance, I've felt. So that was the principle behind growing a hop garden. I mean, I have to say it's been a fantastic experience. Tough. I mean, of course, I go back to the farming. I mean, I had this vision of farming as a bucolic existence where you'd wander out, look at a few plants growing, and then wander back in and drink a bottle of champagne and hope.
That's not champagne, by the way.
and actually, our farmer on the site did have. His great strength was being able to grow houses. If you can grow houses on your land, that's the very best thing you can do. And he actually had 2 planes at one time in the hangar, and a runway in the middle of his one of his largest field. So there was another side to farming, and there still is, but it's mainly selling land for housing. So that was a digression. Going back to the community, I think that was very important for us. So we developed the hop garden. We've then encouraged people to come and help us grow the hops. And we have over 70 hoppers who come and help train the hops, grow the hops. And it's actually turned out to be really, I think they enjoy it because they're out there, they're doing something, they get some beer at the end. We have a kind of hoppers lunch. But they're out in the fresh air, and this became really important during the pandemic, out in the fresh air with other people, doing something. But in the process of doing something else, it's, you kind of build, you seem to build a rapport, which is very important. And I think there's a need for us to be very often to go back to our roots sometimes and do something simple and pleasurable with other people that isn't complex, isn't is relaxing. And I think there's bits of farm work are like that. They just got so much going for them in a way. But so that was part of the plan. We also wanted to go and the other thing I ought to say is that hops are grown in the UK a bit. They're grown in Germany, but a lot of the aromatic hops are grown in the States and on the west side of the States as well, or in Australia, New Zealand, but in South Africa. And therefore, a lot of them are doing a lot of air miles or food miles. And our hop garden originally at the front, but that was all sold for building. We now got a garden 3 times the size at the back, and it touches on the brewery. So the closest point is about 150 yards from the brew house, and so we can honestly say that it's from a field to Firkin in a furlong. And a firkin is the size of a barrel, and a furlong is 220 yards, I think I'm right in saying. And so we pick, we grow, we pick, we dry, we store in recyclable plastic containers in a cold cellar, and then we take it straight to a brew house. So it has had the shortest journey. It is the freshest because it's had the least time sitting in areas where it could dry out or where the sun could get at it. It's kept at a regulated 5 degrees right up until we're brewing with it, so it couldn't be fresher. And so I think freshness and localness are important as well. So that was one of our focuses. And we're now looking at other ways in which we can get to net zero. And that's just a small part, and it's a big journey. It's a tough journey. The industry has committed overall to trying to get to net zero by 2040. The government's target is 2050. The whole of the brewing industry and the pub industry is trying to get there by 2040. That's a big call. We're trying to get there by 2030. Well, 2030 is only 7 years away, so there's a lot to do, and we're starting at that process. One of the things we did is we tried to stop using plastic wherever we could, and we introduced glass flagons, which we call, related to obviously the hog name, we have snifters, snorters or grunters, and grunters are very large, that's 9 pints, and snifters are 4 pints, 4.5 pints, and snorters are, and snifters are 1.5 pint. And it's returnable, so somebody buys it, brings it back to us, we swap it for a clean one, wash it, and that reduces waste enormously. We're just about to install our first array of solar panels. Each batch will be just under 50 kilowatts because there's a planning permission issue. Not that we would get planning permission, but it's just a delay, which we don't want. So we're introducing 50 kilowatt solar panel array on one of our buildings with batteries underneath. And that is going to allow us to power, we've installed a smaller brewery which is operated entirely electrically at the moment, and it'll allow us to power that completely a certain number of times a year, depending on when the sun is shining. More in the summer, less in the winter. But what we will be able to do is put power back into the grid and then kind of borrow that again.
Yeah.
And with batteries, we also hold so for days when it isn't sunny enough, we can still build enough power to brew. But what we'll be able to do then is have beers that are 100% solar powered, essentially. So solar powered brewing. That is not going all the way. It's by no means, because there's a huge amount of energy used in producing the malt, in shipping it, and then of course in shipping the beer to the pubs and all the supermarkets and all the packaging material that goes with it. But we're taking the first step, which I think is called Tier 1, and it's part of Tier 2. We are looking at putting at least another 50 kilowatts and then a third lot of 50 kilowatts on all the roofs in the brewery. We have now started to change the brewery, the what used to be the farmyard, and we're starting to try and attract a new style of tenant that complements what we're doing. We have a brewery shop. We've now opened a bar. And the bar is absolutely wonderful because it looks over the hop garden, which was absolutely always the vision. I wanted originally to have malt growing there, barley growing there as well, so we could malt it. Haven't achieved that yet, but still working on that. And the final stage was to have pigs on the ridge of the hog's back, and they will be fed the spent grain from our brewery. That is still part of the vision, but it is become more challenging because unfortunately the land has all been sold to Taylor Wimpey. And we have a real battle on our hands, which is actually live now. And if anybody's going to the brewery and does like the views at the back, I would plead with you, please make a submission to the AONB, Area of Outstanding Natural Beauty, to keep that in the AONB area, because there's clearly been a push, and it's not hard to guess where it's come from, to try and get it excluded. And that would be absolutely appalling. I mean, from our point of view, if we had more houses, I suppose we would sell more beer, but that's absolutely not what I want. What I would like to do is retain this beautiful scene at the back, which just says this is what a local brewer is about. And if we have our hops and barley and pigs, you see the entire cycle, and we're starting to become as recyclable as we can. We would treat our water through reed beds, and you start to get to the point where there's absolutely no carbon footprint. And in fact, the reverse will be starting to ship out carbon because ship out energy, because we're looking at whether we can get permission to then extend the car park and put solar panels over the top of the car park, raised so that cars can park underneath and they can charge using our battery systems. We won't do the batteries yet because the price of batteries is still too high, but I think the technology is moving on another 3 or 4 years, and I think it will be viable. Probably there will be some further developments that make it viable to have store the energy and then put it into people's cars. One of the things we are doing, I invested when I left my last business. For a period of time, I was an angel investor, so I was looking at businesses and investing in them, and some of them were successes, and some were dogs. And you always get this: you lose money on some and you win on the others. But in this case, if you spot a winner, you try and follow through. And one of them was a company called Oxford Photovoltaics, and I was one of the first investors into that. Sadly, it grew so fast I couldn't follow on, so I'm now a tiny little investor. But Oxford Photovoltaics has produced the next generation of solar panel, which has perovskite on top of it. I don't know if anybody's heard of this yet, but this is going to be the future in 5 years' time, I would imagine, 7 years' time, all solar panels will have a layer of perovskite. And there's 3 or 4 companies around the world that are developing this at the moment. And what it means is you could get a solar panel that will get up to about 35% efficiency. Well, 35% efficiency is, at the moment, we're about 20 to 22% at commercial level, or maybe 25, but it doesn't always get there. 35% is game changer. So they're working on that. Anyway, what I want to do is get that perovskite on the brewery, and if so, I was hoping that we'd do it in June, but we can't at the moment. We'd be the first company in the UK to have these new solar panels. So it's part of a broader commitment just to get to net zero and to be as focused on the environment as well as the community. That is what, for me, local is all about.
That's fantastic. So, can we come and see for ourselves?
Yeah, of course you can. Of course you can. We do tours, and I'm sure we could organise something. And of course, we also have. You're welcome to go anytime into the to the brewery tap. And the great thing about the brewery tap is, if the beer has to be the best you could ever get, or at least as good as you'll ever get. Because actually, I have to say, Mark and his team sell excellent cask beer. Some pubs don't. You know, it's really, you have to, there's quite a skill to selling cask beer, and it requires people who know what they're doing, and we are very keen to focus on quality all the time. So, you know, well, I'm so pleased that we're in New Dawn, because Mark's commitment is to quality, and we're so the beer will always be good. We have pizzas. The pizzas are, I think, always good, wood-fired pizzas, and we're developing another menu. I think what I've learnt is it's not quite as easy as it seems. I think I have growing respect for Mark and his chefs, because we definitely haven't got there yet, but we're getting there. And this is about, you know, everything is about learning, and it's about a journey, and that's actually the fun of it's the fun of business, is learning and trying new things. You know, you kind of would like some of them to succeed, but what you learn is it's not always easy. I've had periods in my career where I've been very lucky, and luck plays such a big part in this. And then other periods where you think, damn, I wish I'd done that. I mean, I have done a little bit of not signing the Beatles in the past, which is just one of those things.
So is there one big mistake you can identify, or one thing you wish you'd done differently?
There's a lot of things, little or big things that I wish I'd done differently. My last business, I'd had enough. It was starting to grow quite fast. There was a deal I could have done that would have really taken us to a next level, and I didn't try very hard for it. That's because I think in my heart of hearts I didn't want to do it anymore. And you sometimes have that. You have cycles where you're interested and not. We were looking at Estrella Dam for the UK, and I said no, too small. Which it was at the time, by the way. It was tiny. And what other brands? There've been 2 or 3 brands where the old company had a very good track requite in selling to the supermarkets, and so we did have quite a few people approach us to say, would you handle this brand or that brand? And I was quite specific about having only a small number of focus brands. But I have to say, sometimes maybe I should have done something different. And actually, what I do realise is there is a buy and build strategy, i.e., which is what I did last time, is a very viable strategy. And interestingly, when markets start consolidating, I mean, we've seen in beer massive fragmentation. What happened, i.e., hundreds of new breweries have popped up. That's not sustainable. There's too many. There are too many. You cannot have that many breweries, especially when the sector is driven so much by economies of scale. So there will be consolidation there, and I would imagine at some point there will be a big opportunity, or maybe a small opportunity, and that's sometimes the point. if it's not a big enough opportunity, is it worth doing? For me, I prefer organic growth now. That's what I really would like to see.
So in the interest of fairness, what's the best decision you ever made?
Well, I've really enjoyed buying hogs back and being able to develop it. It's been very fulfilling, and I think I'm really proud of the business. I think the beers are fantastic. I think what we've done to the site and are continuing to do to the site is great. I think we're offering really good hospitality, but it has been challenging. I mean, it's been really challenging, I would say. You know, the pandemic has been a disaster for all of us. I have to say, particularly for pubs and hospitality, it's been terrible, but it hasn't been great for small brewers. The globals have actually done very well out of it, but not the small brewers. Would that be the thing I'm most proud of? I think that, I suppose there's a few things. I'm very proud of the development of Old Speckled Hen and of Hobgoblin, because those brands both came from very small to large, and I'm hoping that we'll do something similar with Hogsback at some point. But I'm really pleased with what we've achieved so far.
Right, moving on slightly. What do you do when you're not working? You got any hobbies? Anything interesting? Anything
I do quite a few other things. I suppose gardening. I do like making things and building things, and I like pottering around. I'm just at the moment building on my own a natural swimming pond, which is quite a large one. It's about I think it's going to be about 60,000 litres, so it'll be about the same size as a traditional swimming pool, but it'll be a bit longer and thinner. And what I'm doing is there will be no filtration, well, there may be a small filtration system actually as a backup, but essentially what it'll be is just various plants around the edge, and you pump the water around the plants and they suck up all the nitrates and phosphates and the things that actually would make a pool go cloudy. And so hopefully, if it works, you've got a beautiful crystal clear pool that has just been filtered with plants. It'll be bloody cold.
I think it's time to thank Rupert in the normal manner.
Yep.
Thank you very much, sir.